It is a great pleasure to introduce somebody we know very well and we all love to the extent that there has been mention of the Andrew Ross narrative of loss in this university, according to our external review. Andrew is now the head of Learning Support Services in the School of International Letters and Cultures at Arizona State University. He has been there since 2010, and boy, do we know that. His graduate training was at the University of California, Berkeley, and it was in medieval French literature, which explains his current involvement in language technology and computer-assisted language learning.
Wait a minute, how does that explain?
That was ironic. His present professional entanglements include developing and directing a graduate certificate in computer-assisted language learning, the creation of a language technology consortium for Arizona, work with the International Association for Language Learning Technology, and in fact, he's chairing the program committee for the next international conference at Harvard in 2015. Has the call for papers gone out?
It will.
Okay. And he has recently published a new edition of the IALLT, International Association for Language Learning Technology, and the Hispanidades project in collaboration with Columbia University and a number of other institutions. And we are grateful to the Department of Hispanic Studies as well as ITG for supporting us in bringing Andrew here today to share his project with us. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you to ITG, Hispanic Studies, all of my friends and colleagues. It's really good to see you again. So, I'm going to go ahead and close the door and we can shame people as they come in.
Okay.
So, Hispanidades, or Hispanicities, is a project that Stefan Aritos from Columbia University and I conceived of about 4 years ago. And it developed out of our mutual interest in digital storytelling and out of our desire to do what we could to move language instruction outside of a strictly classroom environment and to help students, heritage language learners primarily and bilingual language learners. When I say heritage learner, does everybody know what I mean? Sort of intuitively? Okay, good, don't have to explain that. To have groups of students collaborate on exploring Hispanic identity in different areas of the United States. So in New York, in Phoenix, now in Chicago, San Diego, Seattle, at a variety of different levels. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to walk you through sort of the genesis of the project and the ideas behind it. And when I'm talking about Hispanidades, I don't want you to take away from this talk that this can or should only be done in Spanish, right? We've been discussing the project with people at the University of Paris. We've been discussing the project with people in the UK. So anywhere where there is a heritage language environment and there is in-migration and out-migration of speakers of these languages and some sort of generational history in the area, there's a place that the Hispanidades project, however named, could actually take root and could flourish. So the project is sort of first and foremost about demography, and I apologize for the size of the lettering. It's a little difficult. What you need to know about this slide is that the Hispanic population in the US, self-described Hispanics, are about 15 million as of 2010. You'll notice that in all of these states down here, there are extremely high percentages of Hispanic population, to the extent that New Mexico and soon Texas, actually I think Texas already, is now a minority-majority state, right? Arizona, well, California is, as of this month, majority-minority. Arizona will be by probably 2027.
What New Mexico?
Yeah, you can see New Mexico there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is Hispanic majority, right? So this is a really interesting time and a really interesting place, Arizona, to be doing a project with heritage learners of Spanish. So more specifically, if we drill down into Arizona, there are about 6 million people who live in the state. 4 million of them live in Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is located and where ASU is located. Of those 4 million people, 30% are Hispanic, and 26% of the population speaks a language other than English at home. So we have an enormous population of heritage learners who are particularly badly served in Arizona and frankly at ASU, at least up to this point. We're working on that. So for heritage learners, the issues that at least in the Mexican American community that we run across are students being told that their Spanish is subpar, right? They sound like pochos. Pochos is a Mexican term for somebody who is of Mexican American descent but doesn't speak Spanish very well, right? So there are self-perceived issues with their language. They don't speak the language well. It's always, my Spanish is terrible. My mom tells me my Spanish is terrible. They're not quite integrated into the Anglo side of things, right? So they are always sort of different than other because they're recognizably, physically different in many ways than the Anglo population surrounding them. And a lot of this difference comes out in the registers in which they're able to use their Spanish, right? So it's home Spanish, it's, as a colleague described from New Mexico described it, backyard green chili roasting Spanish, right? It's these informal registers of language that they have, but that they can't surmount at a certain point without the help of a heritage language program. ASU is curious in that we have 5 different course levels of heritage Spanish, which is unusual. Most universities have 1, possibly 2, right? The catch is the program is currently headless. We have nobody running it. So I'm sort of stepping in with the Hispanicities project, which happens at the 300 level. It's kind of a capstone experience for these students. And I'll tell you more sort of about how all of that works. But in any event, what we are doing is we are working very hard in embedding Hispanicities into the broader curriculum. So what is it? First and foremost, it's a framework. You'll hear me describe it as a course. There's a class at the University of Illinois Chicago that is actually going to be titled Hispanicities. Kim Patowski, who's a leading researcher in heritage language instruction, is actually going to be teaching the course for the first time in the fall. So interinstitutional collaboration, bringing together bilingual and heritage learners from separate locations to explore what it means to be Hispanic, using technology to do that. We wanted to involve students at this level in their own research. And by research, I don't mean, I have to use probably air quotes when I'm talking about research, right? Because these are undergraduates who are participating in ethnographic research. They're not doing serious research, but they are conducting interviews in the community. They are getting out there, they're finding results, they're sharing results, all of that happens. And finally, a conscious and purposeful engagement with local communities. So I was thinking about, would Hispanicities actually work in Providence? And I came to the conclusion that it would, but you would have to look, I think, a little harder than perhaps we do for communities of heritage, whatever those are. It could be Russian, it could be Hebrew, it could be Spanish, right? But they exist. It's just simply a question of finding them. So why are we doing this? Well, we think that it's critical, and by we, in this particular slide, I mean Stefan and myself, when we conceived of this, we were responding to some priorities set by our institutions, right? Columbia talks about internationalization, Brown has talked about internationalization, community embeddedness, right? ASU actually has some design principles that I will share with you in just a minute. And the Hispanicities project really fits very neatly with the design principles for the university. This is not simply a pen pal model. So what's happening is students are being encouraged to think critically about what they are reading from their interlocutors at other institutions. They're encouraged to respond critically, to think about sort of how both the external perception of being Hispanic changes from place to place, from New York and the Puerto Rican community, the Dominican community, to being Mexican American in Arizona. Finally, students are not doing this simply from a language perspective, right? We're encouraging them to bring their interests into the project and to look at aspects of culture in the communities that are of interest to them. So we have students who are interested in linguistics, so they're actually looking at the pronunciation of Spanish words by both Hispanics and non-Hispanics in certain situations. Is it mesa or is it mesa, right? And what's the difference? And what does that mean socially and culturally? We have students that are interested in the migrant farm worker, the history and sociology of migrant farm workers in Yuma. So they're out there interviewing, 95-year-old former farm workers to find out what it was like during the Cesar Chavez movement, right? So there's a lot going on here. And so they're encouraged to bring those interests with them. So ASU design aspirations inform what we do at ASU. I can't speak to how much they inform what Columbia does, or University of Illinois Chicago, or other schools. But for us, these are sort of the bedrock values that anything we do at ASU is supposed to include, right? So we're leveraging our place by, well, you saw the demographic map, right? So you understand that we are looking at Hispanicities as from where it springs, right? How do I explain this? We couldn't do this in North Dakota, or at least not as easily, right? So we're leveraging place in that respect. I think we're transforming society in that we are getting students really interested in the political culture surrounding Spanish and the Spanish language and the Hispanic experience in Arizona. Students are entrepreneurial and they're going out, they're making connections in the communities, and they're going back and visiting the people that they actually interviewed, or whose businesses, whose organizations they actually showcased in the digital stories that they do. Enabling student success is critical because students in the Hispanicities project are doing kinds of writing that they've never been asked to do before, and that most undergraduates aren't asked to do until the 400 level at least. So they're moving from, and I'll talk about this in a minute, they're moving from the essay, this sort of one-to-one communication with the faculty member, to micro-publication, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Intellectual disciplines, we're involved with the School for Historical, Political, and Religious Studies, and specifically the Institute for Transborder Studies at ASU, who are interested in using the Hispanicities model as a means of data collection for the kinds of sociological research that they're interested in doing about what it means to live on the border, near the border, with Hispanic communities. Socially embedded, that kind of goes without saying, and globally engaged, depends on the day. So this is what the collaboration map looks like right now, and I wish it didn't. So these are the 5 institutions that are currently involved, and this looks far too much like a daisy for my personal taste, right? What this should look like, and what I hope this will look like if I come back and present this to you again in 2 years, you should be so lucky, is a long chain molecule, right? Where it's not just ASU as the hub of all the activity going on, which is what's happening right now, but that the intermediate class for Spanish speakers at Columbia and the one at University of Washington, all of these will be collaborating with each other as well.
But
right?
currently, that's not the case.
Currently, that's not the case. Everything goes through ASU, weirdly. We've tried to push Columbia out the window, go, fly, find somebody else to participate with too. That hasn't happened yet. So, interesting. So, this diagram is also salient because it speaks to the structure of Hispanidades. The point is not that you have to sacrifice your entire syllabus or your entire curriculum to the project, right? Although you have, in the case of University of Illinois Chicago, an instance where somebody is doing an entire class using this particular framework. So this was originally intended to be a framework in which each class retained its own curriculum, that there were relatively few administrative complexities to deal with. I took a page out of Merle's book with the Rhode Island Language Consortium, right? So there's no tuition exchange. The courses happen at each institution. The only thing you really need are 2 willing instructors and some technical support in order to do this. We tried to make this as light as we possibly could in terms of difficulty, right? The other interesting thing is that collaboration can occur at different points in different classes. So for example, we've worked with the University of Washington, which is on the quarter system, the trimester system. So the collaboration happens late in our semester, but at the very beginning of their semester. And it doesn't extend throughout the whole term, right? It's just a few points during the class where students interact and the materials that rise out of that interaction. What we're finding is that collaboration between institutions really has broadened students' perspectives. They tend to see themselves, at least to some degree, as very local instances with no sort of context in terms of their identity, right? I'm the only Mexican-American kid, you know, in my high school who had this experience. And you get them communicating with other kids who are in fact having the same experiences, but from a Puerto Rican standpoint or Dominican standpoint or sort of a different cultural perspective. And it really sort of opens them up to the idea that there are other people that are experiencing the same kinds of issues that they are. There's a lot of motivation to communicate. We actually had trouble getting the students to stop. I'll show you a web page in just a minute that's from a Columbia ASU exchange. Check the dates. So the communication was supposed to happen in October, and you'll see it goes on a little bit longer than that, right? So what is this? What do students actually do? So at the beginning of each term, they are given a research topic, right? It can be anything of their choosing with some caveats, because we find that they tend to revert to high school or early college paradigms of topics. So the 2 faces of this, right? So they can contrast and compare, great. Or I've forbidden things like platillos típicos, right? The typical dishes that one finds in a restaurant, because that gets really boring. So they have to think a little bit. They have to think a little bit more about something that would interest somebody from elsewhere about their community. And how do they present that? So they're actually ending up curating this community in a certain way for somebody who may not understand it. So we send them out to do interviews with elders in the community. So these could be business people, they could be church leaders, they could be community groups, and but that's not everything. So what they're doing is they're sort of honing in on what they want to do as a final topic, right? So they're exploring a barrio, they're exploring a community, whether it's geographic or religious or social, right? And they're constantly comparing and contrasting what's going on with their peers who are doing the same thing in New York or who are doing the same thing in Chicago. What are you learning? What's the question that you want to ask? What are you finding out? That's different than what happens here, here's why. So there's a sort of contrast and compare going on. They produce a digital artifact, which is variable. That's the kind of interesting thing about this. This is not prescriptive in terms of output. It doesn't have to be a digital story. It could be a blog. It could be a long research paper. There are any number of things that this could be. We just happen to find that a digital story for us works well because it's a type of writing that they are unfamiliar with, and it requires enough editing skills that they can't simply sit down, dash off the script, forget about it, not rehearse it, read it, and they're done. They're constantly having to go back and look and rehearse and prepare and edit. So there's a whole process. I'll talk about that in just a minute as well. We tell them from the beginning that they are researching and curating and disseminating this aspect of culture to a broader audience. This is never about the conversation between the instructor and the student, or even the class. They know when they start this, they'll be preparing something that will be on the web, it will be accessible to people. Actually, this semester is probably when we'll take the site completely live so that you can see all of the digital stories that have been done, some better than others, because that's just the way these go, right? But there will be a showcase of these, and there will also be the opportunity for the communities to comment, right? At the end of every semester, we have a film festival with all the digital stories, and so members of the community who have been interviewed or have otherwise interacted with the students come and actually get to see what the students produced.
Hey, Andrew, I've got a question.
Shoot.
So why do you put ethnographic in quotation marks?
So I gave part of this talk at one point to people who actually did ethnography.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of sort of chuckling around the table. These students they don't get a lot of training in sort of ethnographic methodology, right, or approach. What we do is we train them to use the equipment. We talk about the kinds of questions that they should be asking. We go over things like IRB protocols with them because this is also going to be used for research, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So I want to be careful not to oversell this.
Okay.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So writing process. As I'm sure you all know, for heritage learners, the most difficult thing is writing and writing well. That coupled with grammar, right? So, and occasional vocabulary. But writing is really what we concentrate on. The idea is after the 5-course series at ASU, they should be prepared to do upper division work in Spanish. Right? When they come to us, their levels are all over the place, but their mastery of the 4 skills is really quite asymmetrical. They speak really well, they listen okay, they can read kind of, depending, and they stink at writing. They're just not there. Right? So, in addition to the communication that goes on between the students at different institutions, and that is communication that is not controlled or surveilled by the faculty member, right? They're just writing back and forth, asking questions. So that's where the weird Spanish comes out, right? The process is creating, at ASU at least, a series of written reflections constantly throughout the semester. So they do 5 written reflections, which are then commented on by the other students at the other institutions and vice versa. And then they have this capstone project. And in this, they're scripting. So they actually have to write a script, they have to storyboard it. So they're going out, they're taking pictures, they're commenting on the pictures, they're putting together sort of a comic book of what it's going to look like at the end, right? And then they're creating a short film. They're doing critiques of each other's work, and then there's the final product, and then rehearsals. So assessment is always rubric-based in what we do. So we actually, if people are interested in doing Hispanicities, we will actually supply you with the rubrics. So you don't really even have to think about this a whole lot, except to adapt the rubrics to your own needs. So formative assessments for process, of course, and then summative for the final project. So faculty have to be engaged in this, but it isn't something that is so time-consuming that people can't manage to do this and still get through everything else in the course. So communication with partner instructors at the other institution is absolutely critical. We've had instances where communication sort of dropped and expectations were subtly different, and we didn't know this until the very end of things, and it was a sad situation. So what we encourage faculty to do is to constantly communicate back and forth on things like schedule, so they have to map out sort of the semester's interactions, when they're going to occur, what's the topic of interaction, what's the outcome, what are the goals and objectives. The nice thing about this is that not everything has to be in lockstep, right? You can choose different aspects of the course that you want to share, and then other parts that you don't want to share at all. And that's perfectly fine. They need to understand and support the student communications loop. So we've also had, I think we've all had the experience of either being in a class where somebody got into it, the instructor got into the discussion boards and started correcting people's grammar and language, and then discussion went away because everybody was too intimidated to continue the discussion. So it's a question of helping the instructor let go a little bit in certain areas of the course, while concentrating on the things that are actually going to be graded and are high stakes. Again, sort of all of the assessment of intermediate and final products goes on. We typically do this in pairs or small groups, and we ask students to self-assess along the way. So how am I doing? What's my group doing? So that you don't have the issues of one person doing all the work and the other person taking all the credit. And then integrating the work done in Hispanicities back into the larger course curriculum is kind of critical. So we find that our Spanish Heritage 300 level courses have adapted slightly in the face of Hispanicities, right? At the first time we did this, it was strictly a writing course, and then there was the project. And the students and the faculty perceived the project to be sort of the cherry on top of the work sundae that they had been eating all semester, right? It was just one more thing, it was too much, it wasn't perceived as sort of integral to what was going on in class. And that was probably because it hadn't been explained very well by the instructor, right? Scaffolding is really critical. And again, I'll leave the PowerPoint with you guys rather, and you can use it if you find it, if you would like to participate in the project, we would love to have you participate in the project. We just need to figure out how to make that happen. So, shared space in terms of the project is a difficult one. So we wanted to make things as simple as we possibly could, so we use Google Sites, right? Other universities seem to freak out about Google Sites, and I'm not quite sure why. So we created a template that you can copy freely. There is some content already in there, and you can gin up an instance of Hispanicities in about 5 minutes if you really want to do that, right? But the whole shared space thing is interesting. So in our collaborations with Columbia wanted to use its own personal sort of space for student writing. So what we ended up doing was saying, okay, we'll do that. We're going to continue to use Google Sites, but we have to come up with a third shared space, right? For sort of the public interactions, the cross interactions. So the conceptual framework for Hispanicities is also expressed in the technology, the way that it actually is run. So clear points of contact. It doesn't have to be all the time. It shouldn't be all the time. So points of contact have ranged from 5 to 3 to 2, depending, right? And by points of contact, these are shared assignments that the students work on together, that they comment, that have to do with their eventually creating this digital story, this final project. We try not to make people go lots and lots of different places for resources and instruction. We've created a cookbook for Hispanicities, so if faculty members are interested in doing this, they can simply look at the cookbook. It's got step-by-step instructions on how to set this up, links to materials, we're trying to make this as easy as possible. But we also don't want students having to go 4 different places during the course in order to complete it, because that gets confusing for them. One of the things that is really important in Hispanidades is this comparatist view that we want the students to take. Right? It's very easy to sort of express your own reality. It becomes a little bit more difficult when you have to contextualize that reality against somebody that you've been talking to all semester, or over the course of 4 or 5 weeks. We don't expect uniform production. As I said earlier, Columbia ended up doing blogs. We ended up doing digital stories, one of which I'll show you in a minute. The end product doesn't have to be the same, but they have to be mutually intelligible. They can't be so different in form that they really have nothing to say to one another. Right? And then variance, which is really has to do with mutual intelligibility, right? At ASU, we do reflexiones en historias digitales. Other people use different terms to address these things, their compositions, even the topics in some cases of the compositions are different. So we might be looking at an expository composition that somebody at Columbia wrote. They're looking at a persuasive paper that somebody wrote where we are. So artifacts and outcomes. I'll go quickly over this because, yikes, it's getting late. So our students produce, again, short reflective papers on being Hispanic in Arizona and in the Southwest. There are a range of functional categories that we ask them to write on. Mostly at this point, it's persuasive, it's analytical, synthetic papers, right? The idea is they're not just describing things, they're actually having to be polemic. Digital narrative is what comes out of this, and then the idea behind this is to create digital narratives that we can then map to the landscape in Phoenix and in New York City, and then display those so that people can actually click and they can get the student's digital story of what happened at that particular place at that particular time. So this is a screen grab of one of our courses. So down the left-hand side, you can see all of the guides for all of the compositions, for all of the digital projects, for interviews, everything else. There are sets of readings that you don't see. I haven't expanded those. And then here, there are bios listed that then link out to other pages. So each bio, each group, has its own page that it's curating. But this is really a workspace. Their compositions go up here, their commentaries go up here. It's sort of a holding area and an area of discussion, right? It's not the final project itself. The final project itself looks like this. I hope I have audio. Actually, I can maybe just turn it on. So these two girls did a project on the suburb of Surprise, Arizona. We have interesting names in Arizona. Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and there's Surprise, Arizona.
Pennsylvania's got to be.
Does it?
Intercourse, Pennsylvania.
Well, of course. This was really, so I'm going to show part of it to you, and then after we're done, we can talk a little bit about it, and you can kind of give me your thoughts. You hear that?
La ciudad de Surprise, fundada en 1938, es conocida por ser una ciudad para los jubilados. Aunque la mayor parte de Surprise es agricultural, también tiene sus lugares modernos y nuevos. En ambos lugares de la ciudad se encuentra una población hispana, pero hay ciertos lugares de Surprise en donde los hispanos tienen una presencia más evidente que otra. Hace 12 años la ciudad solamente abarcaba una cuadra. Cuando Surprise estaba en el proceso de establecerse como una ciudad, no había mucha gente hispana. La mayoría de Surprise era una área de agricultura y la mayoría del terreno estaba compuesto de granjas. muchos de los parques y escuelas que existen hoy antes eran lugares para cultivar y para criar animales. Debido al desarrollo de la nueva ciudad, la necesidad de trabajadores crecía. Esto es una de las razones por la que ahora hay muchos hispanos en la parte antigua de la ciudad. Surprise fue creciendo, al igual que la población hispana, y ahora los hispanos forman el 20% de la población de esta ciudad. En el lado oeste de la ciudad se encuentran los lugares más viejos de Surprise. Hay una vía de tierra que sigue el Freeway 60 y casi divide la ciudad. Por un lado están las casas viejas y por otro se ven las casas nuevas.
Okay, so what you don't see is that these girls actually went to the city archives of the council meetings to figure out why it was that the libraries and the schools and the parks in the Hispanic section of the city were never funded or were funded less than in the other areas. So they actually went out and did some, a little social movement work, which was great. And we're finding that more and more students are engaged in this kind of thing. And we encourage that strongly, given Arizona's history and current climate. So extending Hispanidades, I promised that this was about Hispanidades and beyond, right? So this is a mock-up of a sticker that we'll be putting onto buildings throughout Arizona where interviews have been conducted in Hispanidades. So we'll see about this, right? I like the idea. So the idea would be that you have your smartphone, you point it at the QR code, and you get the digital story of that place, right? Right on your device. I've been told that QR codes kill kittens. So which really means that people tend not to use them, right? It's already too complex. I gotta get my phone, really. So we'll see how this goes. We haven't gotten a lot of traffic return from the couple of these that we've already put out. But we really like the idea of getting the project out in the community so that people in the community can see what we've done, right? And become engaged in the discussion. So one of the things that's happening with the project is that it's morphing away from an exploration of geographic space to an exploration of social space and the role of language in that social space. So all of you are familiar with the concept of linguistic landscapes? Yes, no? Yes?
It's more or less. Can you talk a bit about that?
It is obvious. I mean, it's one of those things that's, so Ilana Shohami, among other people, Ilana works at University of, I want to say Tel Aviv in Israel. And so one of the things she started looking at was language represented in signage, in public signage. Mm-hmm. So in Israel, it's a particularly interesting question, right? Because you have three official languages. You have Hebrew, you have Arabic, and you have English, right? But in practice, there are some languages that show up almost never in certain situations, and there are others that show up all the time. So I was at a conference where she was presenting, and she showed a hospital, the inside of a hospital corridor, and there was a sign in Hebrew leading toward rocket shelters, right, in case something happens, and then in Arabic and English, pointing the other way, was emergency exit. And then there was a sign for emergency room.
Everybody deserves to be saved.
Apparently. But there was a sign for emergency room that was in Hebrew only, and when she asked, well, why is this sign in Hebrew only, she was told by a hospital administrator, well, they should learn Hebrew. Right? So Arizona has some other interesting issues, right? But some very similar issues. And what we want students to look at, and what they're coming to on their own, is when are signs in Spanish? When are signs in English and Spanish? And what do those tend to be? So you have Tío Rico Te Ayuda, which is a payday loan outfit, right? That's all over parts of Phoenix, but no place else. It's got another name for Anglo areas. You've got vote here, vote aquí. The interesting story behind this slide is that in the Spanish language voter information for Arizona, they put the date of the election wrong, late by 2 days.
Clearly by accident.
Kind of a problem,
Clearly by
right? They corrected it, but still. So smuggling and illegal immigration may be encountered in this area. Why wouldn't that be in Spanish?
Because they are the illegal immigrants and they smuggle.
And then this one, which just absolutely blew my mind. This is a sign from a state vehicle testing garage, right? You go in and you get your vehicle tested so you can get your license tab, right?
Only one is translated.
Only one is translated. All of the instructions are English except offering a bribe is a crime. Violators may be prosecuted. That's also in Spanish. So what we really want students to do to get out of this project is that language is meaningful locally. Their experience of language is meaningful and socially connected, right? And to the situation that some of them find themselves in. I'll be really quick. I've got maybe 1 or 2 more slides, and I promise I'll be done. Exploring communities works outside of ASU as well, right? Working with Columbia has been a challenge in that Columbia wants to work with other Ivies, or it wants to work with people that it knows. And wants, it'll work with us, but it'd be better if we were Yale. So what we've done, on the other hand, is we've moved this out to the community. So we're actually working with Boys and Girls Clubs in Tempe. This is a particularly interesting case because a lot of the kids in the Tempe Boys and Girls Club are Hispanic, and their families have lived in Tempe for a long time. Arizona State University is what was built over the Hispanic barrio in Tempe. So the Spanish-speaking neighborhood in Tempe was destroyed to make room for ASU. So we have some responsibility there, right? So working with these kids on this. I'm sure you've all heard about State Bill 1070. No, it's the legal immigration bill. You can be stopped. You can be asked for your papers, your immigration status, right? That's Arizona. But even more, I think, insidiously, there was a recent law passed a few years ago now, essentially making ethnic studies illegal in K-12 schools in Arizona. Any curriculum that, and the premise for this was any curriculum that values one class or group of people over another is a no-no. And so, of course, by extension, anything that talks about those groups in a positive way, right, is also a no-no. So no ethnic studies in Arizona. So the idea is that we're trying to rebuild a sense of pride in the Hispanic community around Phoenix and elsewhere. Current communities, we're kind of all over the map, but it's true that we're getting less and less involved with place and more involved with organizations. So we work with the Cca Foundation. This is a local foundation in Chandler, Arizona. They send robotics teams to NASA competitions, and they have, it's for poor kids. They have after-school dinners and lunches and math nights, and it's packed. And so they're really doing some interesting things. Avila Youth Leadership Institute has as its mission preparing Hispanic youth for college. So the Hispanicities Project website is up in embryonic form. The cookbook is almost ready to go live. I'll send you those links as soon as it does. But we're also going to be returning the Hispanicities Project into a collector of resources, which will go into a repository for both linguistic research, sociological research in some cases, So we're looking to build Spanish variants that are mapped to communities, so in both written and spoken Spanish. And then this aggregation of digital stories and mapping. Recently, we've begun working with actual K-12 schools, 2 in Virginia, 1 in Colorado, and a high school in Orange County who are interested in putting this into their curriculum. So I need more hours in the day than I actually have for this. But it's going interestingly. So finally, the model extends, and that's a terrible graphic of an umbrella, but right now we're looking at both Chinese and Vietnamese as languages to extend this to. I would argue that any community that has a strong heritage presence in an area is probably game for using this particular model. And so that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you.